Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of the Rational Stud podcast. I'm joined by Ayanda Zulu and Zakhele Mthembu, and we've got some interesting topics today. Fortunately, we will not be discussing the aftermath of the G20 because I think we're all very fatigued over that topic. Instead, we're going to be discussing a topic which we're probably even more tired about, which is South Africa's scourge of crime. So the acting minister of police released the quarterly crime reports this morning. There's a lot of numbers. We're not going to read out every single number, but to summarize, a lot of different reported crimes. I have to note here, this is very important, and we probably are going to discuss this in depth, that these are only reported crimes. This is not a reflective of all the crimes happening in this country. But in general, it seems that murders are down, at least reported murders, and petty crimes, so burglaries, housebreakings, all that those are down since 2024 and since previous quarters. But sexual offences are up, which is particularly pertinent considering that gender-based violence has been considered a national disaster. Whereas I have to wonder why now? Why hasn't it been disaster for a very long time? I think it's just the usual ANC liking to declare things just so they can pretend they're actually doing something. But I think that let's move on to Ayanda. So in general, so I don't expect any of us to have looked and scanned these numbers. I can actually let me put them on the screen just so you guys can all see how damn so you guys can see that this is not something where we can be considered why we're not going to be reading every single number. But you can see the red bad, green good. But at the same time, Ayanda, I would like you to tell us how useful is this information? How useful are these reports, considering that these are only reported crimes, and that SAPS, to be charitable, is not the most competent or trustworthy of organizations?
Yeah, Nicholas. I think as I told you earlier on when you were speaking on WhatsApp, I'm not too concerned about the numbers, even as I'm a numbers guy, but I'm not too concerned about the numbers when it comes to crime, especially the latest stats. I think for me, like any other South African, what we know for a fact is that we have a crime crisis in this country. And the thing about the data, the one important point that is always raised in these conversations around crime, as you also said, is that how many crimes in this country are actually not reported? Because that's a very, very important thing, right? What we know are these are reported crimes. How many crimes in the country actually go unreported, unregistered, so no one knows that they've even taken place? So you might look at something like rape, for instance, which is also another scourge in this country, where in some cases you have rape taking place within families. For example, in the context of a family, you have an elder who sexually molests a young person in the family, and for whatever reason, that kind of thing is not reported. The family sweeps it under the rug, or they talk it out, right, or whatever, and that kind of case goes unreported. That is a crime, of course, but that goes unreported. So those are some of the kinds of things that I tend to think about, specifically when it comes to rape. When you look at the reported cases, which are also high, by the way, I must add. But I think for this discussion around crime, Nicholas, I want to make two very important points, and I want to confine myself to the Western Cape, which is still being confronted by this massive issue of gang violence, which has torn families apart, which continues to claim so many lives every day in this country, and really destabilize communities. And I raise this because the youth leader of the Patriotic Alliance, Liam Jacobs, I think next week they're going to have a march that wants to raise awareness around this issue of violence, gang violence in the Western Cape. And one of the things that I told him on X, because I know him personally, he used to go to UP and I've had engagements with him personally at UP. One of the points that I made to him on X, I was like, Liam, look, what you guys are dealing with that side, and I know this is something which they're personally invested in because they are a colored party, quote unquote. So this is something which they feel a very close attachment to. So one of the points that I made to him was that, Liam, in raising awareness about this fight against crime, you guys also need to focus on the solutions and how this can be addressed. And one of the ways in which you guys can try to fix this thing really is to support the devolution of policing powers, especially in this case in the Western Cape. And that immediately that adds more capacity to the system, and it allows for more well capacitated response, if I can say that, to crime. Because one of the things that Senzo Mkhunu acknowledged when he was at the Madlanga Commission, and he said this, he said, we don't have the machinery to fight crime in the province. So an immediate benefit of devolving policing powers is that you expand the capacity of the police force. You immediately have more personnel with its own infrastructure, with its own weapons, and all those things. And you're able to fight crime more effectively, as opposed to a situation you have now where the DA always complains that we're hamstrung, we don't have the power to fight. And Martin, of course, tells him, just go ahead and do it. Don't even wait for the central government to give you permission, But that's sort of the situation you have. So the point that I made to him was that, look, Liam, you guys need to stop playing politics, because the PA is also really part of the ANC's little club there. I mean, I get the sense that they're sort of aligned to the ANC, even in how they move in coalitions as well. But that's the point I made to him, that Liam, you guys need to actually really look into devolution. The other point that I want to make here is this discussion we also have about crime, and how some people argue that there's a straight line between inequality and crime, or a straight line between poverty and crime. And look, it's important to be nuanced. So I'm not going to challenge that point entirely, So maybe to some extent you might argue that poverty or extreme deprivation does drive people into crime. But I think the broader problem that we have, specifically on this thing of gang violence, I think is a societal issue that we have. And you, Nicholas, have touched on this on Facebook in one post you made, where you said that we need to look at the kind of environment in which these young men who end up becoming gangsters or who go into gangsterism, what kind of environment do they grow in? What kind of family do they come from? Do they come from stable families where both parents are present, both parents are active in their lives, especially the young men, right? Because for the young men, it's important for them to undergo something that marks that transition, as you said, from boyhood to manhood, right? So amaXhosa, for instance, on that side of the country, they have their whole thing of initiation where the boys go to the mountain where they learn certain things, and that marks that transition from boyhood to manhood. You mentioned the Jews, who also have their own processes of facilitating that transition, and you sort of want to ask that with these young men, what marks that transition into adulthood or into manhood. And for many of them, you find that they are initiated into gangsterism. That's their way of becoming men, being initiated into gangsterism, learning how to kill people, learning how to sell drugs. And you find in some cases that the gangsters that they end up working for are people who have assisted their own families. Maybe you come from a poor family, and that gangster assists your family. He feeds your family, he provides food, or he provides some degree of security, and you end up being drawn, into that world as a young man, and you find yourself, doing gangsterism. So there's a need to also look at the social drivers of crime. What are the other factors in this country, really, which I think are more important, that drive crime? What drives these young men? And I think if we're going to ask that question, we're going to realize that there's much more work. Of course, policy interventions are necessary. You need to crack down on crime. There's no doubt about that. But beyond those policy interventions, what needs to be done in society to try and really build a better society where we don't produce young men who are driven into this kind of lifestyle? And that requires a holistic response. Individuals, families, communities, civil society, churches, all those forces need to rally really and work together to say that even if a young man doesn't come from a stable family. Maybe he doesn't come from a family where his father's present, but he still has leadership and mentorship in his life in the form of a pastor, in the form of an elder in the community, right? Because for boys, it's very important to have people in your life who model positive masculinity, or who model positive ideals of what being a man is about. Those kinds of things are very, very, I think, important. So I think those are just my initial thoughts on this question of crime.
Thank you. I agree with you completely, especially because a lot of what you're saying was quoting what I was saying, which I always appreciate. But also, you added onto that even more. And I remember you've spoken about this on Facebook as well and on Twitter. The book that spurred my Facebook post is a very good book. Advise anyone who's interested in gangsterism, especially in Cape Town, to read Gangtown by Don Pennock. It goes into Cape Town gangsterism and specifically the history of the gangs, and also why and the cause of people joining gangs. Because I think that there's a separation between gang membership and people just becoming criminals. And I think that's something which kind of goes to the heart of this conversation, is what causes crime and how do we actually address it. And I think I agree with you. It's a holistic approach, because it can't just be, as much as we need to fix our police force, there's no, you can't get rid of crime at all if you don't have deterrence. So we need to fix our police force, but there also has to be social changes on the ground, and that's a lot harder to get right. Zex, on top of any other comment you want to make, I also want to ask you, what is your view? I'm just going to throw the hard question at you, because I don't know the answer. Why is South Africa so just in particular so infected with crime?
Yeah, right. It is a tough one, because we have extremely high crime levels. By the way, I'm a huge numbers guy. I love numbers because they give us context, right? Not a consequentialist, but I love the ideas, at least, of having physical proof. So yeah, before I get to your question on why South Africa is like hamstrung by such high crime, right? Because I think there's a myriad of factors that make us pretty primed to have these high crime rates, including, of course, our data collection capabilities, right, in comparison to other similar economies who may not be as great in collecting data about their criminal activities. But yeah, we have a myriad of factors. So we have large poverty levels, we have large instances of just broken families, as Makeba has spoken about. So our communities in general, in large part, are dysfunctional, right? And then you look at the dysfunction of what caused these communities. You had a system of labor that was implemented that necessitated people having to detach from their families, and that became a norm for multiple generations. You had 3 generations of people growing up not having father figures, because their father figures had to go work, because they could not stay at home, because they were forced to pay taxes by the British state, because the colonization, conquest, and everything that comes with conquest and occupation, right? And all of the myriad of factors that cause this, and like the trickle down effects of them, is the normalization of inherently broken familial system. That's why you would find in certain communities you have the normalization of single person headed households, even at the highest level, right? Either be it by a woman or a man, because I think that both parties are like necessary, right? So you still find people who are raised by their fathers who, I guess, to Makeba's point, they did not have a positive model of masculinity. They had a negative one. So, and that also is problematic, right? When it is not balanced by, as much as the modern man may not like to hear it, by like having a feminine person raising you too, because you are still a combination of both masculinity and femininity. You would say that high levels of violence comes from an over or lack of empathy, right? And empathy some may associate with femininity, but that is another conversation for another time. But we don't have family structures for a myriad of reasons that are, especially in like the black community, the colored community, and like all these communities that were pretty much lesser than communities in our previous dispensation. you have this broken foundation of families, and you have, once that is broken, it makes everything else outside that like stems from that very, very, very difficult to solve, right? And that is why I think really, I'm a proponent of liberty as much as I am, because the only way that can change, right, is if people choose to change it. Is if people choose to change it. As I said, anecdotally, right, I was raised by, my uncles and my aunts, but my parents passed away a long time ago. I never thought of being a criminal. Come from a very poor area, like an extremely poor, poverty-stricken area, and I never was a criminal. I know many of people who weren't criminals. So, the idea of an environment also, even though I mentioned it being the number one driver of how people take actions, I'm not a huge proponent of that. I'm a huge believer in agency. We all make individual choices. So irrespective of whatever environment you may come from, right, all the things that I mentioned, it is still up to you. I think the question is, why do South African individuals like committing crime so much? Really, rather than having, South Africa as the place being filled with, crime, because South Africa doesn't have a bunch of South African individuals who commit a whole lot of crimes. And I think now getting into my point about what the numbers show us, right, is that I think a large part, like criminals in any society are always a minority. I would like to believe, because if, a majority of society were criminals, then there would be no peaceful coexistence, right? So I would like to think that, a majority of criminals in any society are a minority of that particular society. And I think that this is where the justice system can play a very, pivotal role. Makeba mentioned things like rape, right? In South Africa, we have a huge backlog of rape kits that the state just has not tested yet, meaning that is evidence that could be used to prosecute people who have committed a crime, and like all the steps have been followed. Like they committed a crime, someone reported it, they took the rape kit, and the state is supposed to test it so that it can be used as evidence in prosecution. And there's just a backlog going back to the thousands, right, of these rape kits just not being tested. And I'm like, things like that, could, like an entire policy decision, something that the state, since it has, especially I wanted to talk about this since they declared GBV a national crisis, right? I'm like, unemployment was a national crisis too, and I think it increased year on year since the ANC was like, no, it's a crisis. So, it does not bode well for GBV that it was declared a crisis, because chances are it will probably get worse. But still, though, it is something that if the state was serious about, tackling with this crime on the state level, on the policy level, which I think that this is where, at the very least, beyond, just telling people to take better decisions, where a whole lot of, change can be enacted, as I said, just eliminating the backlog of rape kits, allowing the prosecutions to have much more stronger evidence would change a whole lot about the perception that a lot of people who are victims of these crimes have about the South African justice system, right? Because we have not potential rapists walking around in South Africa, and because there's no evidence, because the states do not follow through on their one duty of protecting your life, your liberty, and your property. And part of that is, prosecuting those who threaten those things. And I think, yeah, the numbers firstly are good, right? When crime is going down, I would never share on that, because it means that there are less people, even if it's reported crimes, right? There are less people who are reporting these crimes, people who would otherwise reported them, because clearly in the past there were more and now there are less, and our population has not decreased. So, there's no bad in that. I don't think, at least in my estimation, it is good. When there are less murders, it is good. When there are less thefts, it is good. All of this, to me, is very good. I am like quite happy about it. Quite surprised, of course, but still happy about it, because it means that, your data is great about that. It makes you see the forest for the trees, right? The tree you're looking at is not the entirety of the picture. And it kind of helps when you see a bigger picture, like, okay, cool. Everything may be horrible, maybe for me personally, even though I'm a Joburg guy, even though crime is a thing, maybe I would like, it hasn't affected me in quite a while. So, maybe I see the anecdotal experience of the statistics and I'm like, hey, cool, I get that, makes sense. But if you had just been robbed yesterday, then you'd be like, fuck the SAPS. There's no way the crime is that low. So yeah, I think the numbers are great. The numbers are good. And also just getting into them, right? Gauteng contributed the most, I think, to the decrease in crime, because it had, the highest year-on-year decrease in reported crimes, right? And I'm like, this is quite interesting because Gauteng had the Amapanyazas that were declared illegal. I'm like, hey, Panyaza was pretty smart, and I'm a huge fan of decentralization since I want a version of something that looks like Amapanyaza in every province, especially the one that is suffering the most from crime, right? In a province like the Western Cape, I think it would benefit from something like that. But I'm like, yeah, Panyaza gets into the numbers and tries to spin them in his own benefit. I'll be like, yeah, great. I also want to spin them in the benefit of decentralization. And like, yeah, see, these provincial police forces do contribute to, a decrease in crime, illegal or not illegal. So, it must be up to us to see what we want really. Do we want illegal stopping to crime or the legal continuation of crime? I guess so that should be the question. But yeah, I think those are my thoughts for now.
I think that we all are wanting some more decentralized police. I'm saying I think my problem with the in what happened in Gauteng is I'm just jealous. I want it in the Western Cape. So I agree with you completely. I think that I wrote an article, I think this month or last month, where I was saying that Jordan Hill Lewis, I was basically quoting Martin again, where I said that the Metro Police should just be, like they say, let them be detectives. And I said, hey, the part of Metro Police is that they're supposed to prevent crime. Investigating crime prevents crime, so they're already allowed. Hey, it's legal. Do it. The part that I want to discuss about
I'm so ridiculous. I like that interpretation right there. I like some great
I should be a
interpretation
lawyer,
of the statute. Definitely. I like that.
Yeah. So so something as well. So I think a big part of what you're saying is the numbers, the trend is down. And I think part of it is because the crime is going down in some aspects. I do think there is more, possibly also more underreporting than there was in the past. We see that with new surveys. I think it's over 62% of over 62% of South Africans don't trust the police, and by that virtue, they're probably not reporting. But Ayanda, you wanting to jump in quickly before I continue?
Yes, just to add the usual points. Really, there's nothing novel that I'm saying here. I think a few weeks back, if I'm not sure if it was last week or the week before that, right? And on that point of confidence, which you note, yes, we have lost confidence. I would argue that confidence is at an all-time low, not just in the SAPS, but in our criminal justice system as a whole. But also how our crime levels also discourage sort of investment in the country, as Patrice Motsepe said not long ago, right? Because investors want certainty, they want returns on their investments, and they want to know that their investments are going to be secure. So in a country with such high crime levels, that does bring that certainty into question. And as he said, it does lead to a decline in confidence on the side of the investment community. So solving crime again really is in the best interests of the country, also economically, if we want to attract investment. I mean, if I was to think of it on an individual level with myself, I would not want to invest in a country with the kinds of crime levels that we had. So that is important. The other point that I wanted to make, I'm not a fan of Nayib Bukele of El Salvador. Not a fan of the guy, but I think the one thing which I have taken from that guy's approach, and I alluded to this earlier on, is that you need to crack down on crime when it comes to the policy intervention side of things. Never mind the other work we need to do in society. You need to be hard on criminals. You need to crack down on them. I think this idea that some people raise, about Brett Heron, for instance, of the good party. I remember when Ian Cameron and others went into Philippi, I think, in the Western Cape, where they were attacked by people. That discussion that Brett Heron and them tried to raise, which I think was unnecessary, even though they had valid points, but they almost tried to suggest that Ian Cameron and others were wrong for defending themselves, and I was like, but this is such an insidious argument, for lack of a better word. how is it wrong for Ian Cameron and others who were in the vehicle to try and defend themselves when they were attacked? I mean, those young men literally attacked them. They struck the car with rocks, if I'm not wrong. So how are they supposed to respond? You know, is it now wrong to defend yourself as a person in the face of violence? I mean, Ian was visibly hurt, and we saw this. So I think it's important for us to remind people that there's nothing wrong with defending yourself. If you do find yourself in that kind of situation, it isn't criminal or even racist as they try to suggest to defend yourself. And it's important for us to crack down on crime. I believe that people who commit violent crimes are evil people. You know, I'm not going to waste time trying to understand what kind of background they come from. Did they suffer trauma as young people? I don't think I want to understand that. What I'm more interested in is cracking down on you, and preventing you from actively harming someone else. And then on this note of Amapanyaza again, which Martin wrote about not so long ago in the Daily Friend. Again, I'm not a huge fan of them because of some of the, especially Pretoria side, some of the apartheid-like tactics that they engage in here, that we see, where, you know, they stop people here and they're asking us for IDs and stuff, you know, or they sort of profile you, and if you look funny, you know, like me, because sometimes I wear very, you know, funny clothes, you know, and then that you know makes them profile you, and then you have them stopping you, you know. I mean, that just when this was a few weeks back, I was going with two other people, we were stopped by them, you know, and I was like, why are these guys stopping us, you know? Someone guy had a bag on, they came out with torches and stuff, you know. So that's why you know, I'm not a huge fan of them. But the principle, right, that principle of devolving policing powers, as Zex has suggested, I think is a good one. It's a valuable one. It allows us to tackle the issue more effectively because, as I said earlier on, you have more capacity, you have an entirely new layer that has its own infrastructure and personnel that helps us to tackle crime really more effectively. But just the point that I wanted to really add was the thing about investment and how it's important for us to bring down these levels of crime. You have to wage a war against criminals. You cannot exercise leniency towards them. Just have to fight fire with fire. Really, it's important.
Yeah.
But so
Cool.
just
Can I
before,
come in, Nicholas? Oh yeah. Go
yeah,
in,
no, I
bro, and
just
I'll
wanted to
come
add
in
because
after you.
yeah, just a brief thing, and then I'll have my main points after you.
Alright,
Just to say, as you alluded to earlier, Zakes, when you know the nationals declaring unemployment a national disaster, and unemployment gets worse, and our GBV is going to get worse.
yeah.
Whenever the government declares war on something, they lose. So, do we really want the government to declare war on criminals? I think what we
Right.
should do is politicize criminals, and they're becoming incredibly inefficient.
Hey,
You, Zakes.
yeah, I think you're on the right track. I might lean more to your side, Nicholas, because like as I said, Makeba is kind of like in a contradiction, right? Because he says the reason it doesn't like the Panyazas is because they randomly stopped him. They waged war on him because they suspected he was a criminal. How else are they to know that he was a criminal, right? Unless you're saying they must wait every time, and like when you commit it, which is, by the way, I'm like, hey, I'm all for that. More for that. But I'm like, you can't then hate that, which comes with waging war on criminals. That's what Bukele does, right? Bukele, if you have a bunch of tattoos that a bunch of other gangsters, you know, have, most cases are not, you'll be taken in and you will not be treated nicely. That is what waging war looks like. Fighting fire with fire is, I guess, what the KZN police commissioner does, right? With the extrajudicial executions of criminals that, you know, happen every time the KZN police go out and hunt of criminals, right? To have a bunch of suspected, alleged, right? And I think this is a very important thing. There are a lot of people who, especially in South Africa, since we have a high crime levels, I, as the legal eagle, I get very scared, right? When people are like, you know, fight fire with criminals. I'm like, yo, you do understand that, like, when someone is interacting with the police, they are still a suspected criminal. They, like, until a conviction comes in, of course there are different contexts, right? The police sees someone literally robbing someone, you know, technically they still are suspected, but you know, it is a virtual formality that they will have a conviction. But that is not always the case, right? Like as you said, Makeba, they can think that you're a criminal, but they don't know that. They don't know that. They will say that they are cracking down on crime. Maybe you were wearing clothes that a whole lot. They can prove all of this. Profiling is something that a lot of police departments are in favor of, and really you cannot work in the police without profiling, right? Perpetrators or potential people are described in characteristics that will then make it easy for you to identify them in a group of people, aka profile them, right? So like it is quite an integral part of the security system. But I think that if we say that the police should wage, war on crime, beyond Nicholas's point that every war the government wages on something they lose. So we might actually have like high crime on that. Beyond that very good point, I think that I'm a huge fan of our criminal procedural system. I think given our history, you see why it was necessitated, and I just am. But I guess as a libertarian, right, I'd never be like, hey, the state boot have more power over me. Here am I? No. I'm all in favor of what you said, that like maybe we should argue for much more even stringent self-defense or private defense laws, right? Because in South Africa they aren't as strong as they might be in places like in some states in the US with like stand your ground laws. But like maybe we should out like I'm all in favor for that. People, like actual individuals, should have the power to like protect themselves from potential criminals or actual criminals when they're committing a crime. And I'm like I'm wholly for that. I am wholly for that, and that is the case. But that I see on the point, like, there has to be evidence of everything, right? I can't say that the police were attacked by a criminal because the police said so. No. I mean, there has to be evidence. Let us do investigations of those shooting sites. If there's evidence of the police being attacked first, then great. Let the police defend themselves. But I don't like the idea of every time you go and hunt for criminals end up dead. I mean, that is problematic. Potential criminals, I might add, right? If it's in self-defense, it's something that can be proven. I'm all in favor for it. But I'm like, man, the idea that it's normal to have someone be murdered without them having that day in court is a very dangerous idea, right? What happens when you are the one who is suspected of something and the police kill you extrajudicially, right? I doubt it would be, but in general, on a legal basis, I will never be in favor of, especially something like that. But of course, I'm all in favor of self-defense, as I said. Get individuals. Let's make having guns much more easier, right? I'm all for that. Let's get rid of organizations like Gun Free SA because they suck. But like, let's just give the power to the individual, try and decentralize as much of the state power as we possibly can. And as much as I want the state to like come down, like I'm a Walter Block when it comes to responses to violence, right? Like an eye for an eye and a leg and a thumb. And, because the person who initiates violence cannot dictate its response, right? So they have just like eliminated all rules of normal civility. But I don't want the state to be emboldened enough for it to think that, since crime is high, I can now skirt a little bit of our very good criminal procedural, statutes that like, the logic thereof are meant to determine guilt, right? Once guilt has been determined, I think we can have that conversation after on like sentencing on how it can look like. But before the perfect, when you're still interacting with the police, I think you should be very wary, right, of like not giving too much power to the state's boot. But yeah, that was my response to Makeba's point, because I was like, I saw the contradiction. If he wants to like a Bukele-like administration, then he will have to deal with being profiled in the street, right? It will just have to come with that. So I think he should pick a leg. Either he wants war waged on criminals or he's all for criminal procedure that is proper. But I'm sure there's a middle road there that will, satisfy, I guess, everyone. So yeah.
I think it's bold of you to assume that we can satisfy everyone. But I think that something which is very important, what I want to talk about as well, is that I think the big problem with the Panyazas and South Africa's approach to policing in general is it's founded still in the ANC ideology of visible policing trumping investigation. And that is the issue. We have, I think I saw the 8th largest police force in the world. We actually have a huge police force. It's not, they're not undermanned. They're undertrained, they're under-equipped, all that, but we're not undermanned. We have too many police. The problem is that even if you had a million police running around all the time, they can't be everywhere all at once. The second they're out, they're not patrolling one street, a crime can occur there. And there's and the problem is that once a crime's happened, it needs to be investigated, and our police are not equipped to investigate it properly. So so in the 90s and pre-90s, and we can say a lot of stuff about the apartheid government, a lot of very bad stuff, but one thing they were good at was oppressing people. And unfortunately, a big part of oppressing people is that you need to have a quite sophisticated law enforcement. And the problem is, as a part of the revenge of taking down the apartheid infrastructure, they decided to destroy infrastructure that would have actually benefited the post-1994 society. And one of the big things they did is that detectives and police used to be on two different structures. They used to be decentralized. So we effectively had like a police force, and we had kind of like an FBI. And so detectives were not beholden to police. They had their own structures, because we watch in TV shows, detectives are these mavericks. They're these creatives. They're not supposed to be, called sergeant and, made to march and rank and file, whatever. They can come from the police force, but they function on a different level. And the problem is that I don't think the South African government takes that seriously, that we need detectives, because that's something where we are undermanned. We don't have enough detectives. They've got ludicrous amounts of case dockets per detective, and they're not properly equipped for it. The fact that they have to wait years to get a rape kit processed, when I'm pretty sure in America it happens in like 24 to 48 hours. That, I think, is the issue, is that with Panyazas, we have this visible policing, which is going to be using profiling. It's going to be doing these stop and searches, which are not good. I don't like that. When instead the focus should be on using the tools of because I would say that even during apartheid, the stop and searches were not what was actually stopping the enemies of the apartheid government, of the insurgents. It was informants, it was spies, it was turncoats, it was the reason that the MK, the old one, not the new one, was not really able to get that far in terms in its war for liberation struggle, and why it was taken down by politics, and apartheid was destroyed by politics and economics, and not by insurgency and war, was because the party government was incredibly good at taking down criminal syndicates and taking down terror syndicates. And that is done through infiltration, through intelligence gathering, through knowing what a criminal or a terrorist is going to do before they even know what they're going to do. And you can use that through patterns. I think if we had, our police force should be looking at how other countries have taken down the mafias, taken down syndicates, and learning from them. But here's also another issue. So I do believe that some of our petty crime has gone down. I believe the stats are not completely just because of underreporting. But I think the reason this is happening is because of something quite insidious. So this is before the podcast started. This is the hypothesis I was building. I was telling Zex in WhatsApp, is that I believe that South Africa's criminal ecosystem is transferring from a petty, opportunistic criminal ecosystem into a more institutionalized, cartelized system where we're being dominated by very organized mafias and syndicates. So I remember that I think it was the chief of the FBI decades ago warned the country, he warned the powers that be, that if they destroy the Italian mafia, violence is going to go up, because the Italian mafia was actually a source of stability, because a lot of these criminal gangs and syndicates, the organized ones, not the little random street gangs which are just going to go shoot people all the time, they want order. They're still doing violence, but their violence is more direct. It's more under the in the shadows, and also they've got connections to the police. So even if it is reported, it's just going to disappear. So I think, and we know that the South African government's captured by criminal syndicates. We know that the police are captured by criminal syndicates. So I believe that a lot of the crime is starting to shift towards being a lot more organized, which is maybe nicer if you for the immediacy that you have a slightly lower chance of having your house burgled, but it's very bad for investments in the country. This is Ayanda, and also trying to get good results from our government, and for the general thing, which I don't think I really need to explain, that we really want crime lords controlling our country from the shadows. It's not really good for business or for living. I think my closing point for this topic, before we briefly go on to the second topic, which is admittedly not as interesting as this one, but probably it does actually link, is that unemployment and crime are possibly South Africa's two biggest issues. I think those are the issues that all opposition parties should be focusing on. I think they should almost ignore everything else, and everything should be feeding into how do we solve unemployment, which is broad. Disrupt the labor market. We need to disrupt labor regulations. We need to get rid of BE, because all the stuff is holding back employers from employing. And then we need to also eliminate crime, so people can actually feel safe, so people want to invest. And also they feed into each other, because there are lots of people who are probably criminals because they're unemployed. Not all of them. There are psychos out there who are just doing it for kicks, or because they feel that they can make more money from it and they don't want a real job. But there are a hang of a lot of opportunistic criminals who, if they could get a proper, safe job, would probably want it. And also, if it also prevents a future generation of criminals, because if some people get jobs and gainful employment, then they're going to be able to feed their families. They're going to be able to provide education, nourishment, and all these things that are going to further down the line prevent their children from wanting to become criminals or needing to become criminals. So it's a long-term thing. But effectively, we should just be focusing on eliminating unemployment and providing more deterrence for crime. Because I think that we're not going to solve, because I agree with you completely, I think the broken families is the foundational structure of what's caused crime in this country. But that's happened over hundreds of years. So we're not going to solve it overnight. The way we're going to solve it is we have to have policies that prevent it from continuing to happen, while also providing deterrence and investigation to break down these syndicates, to break down these gangs, and to make people realize that crime doesn't pay. So it's a two-pronged response. I think that this was an interesting topic. I think we could see that this is why it took the lion's share of the podcast. But it does link into our second topic, which I think is worth touching on. Because, I brought up the old MK, and now it's time to talk about the new MK, and how Jacob Zuma's daughter was snitched on by his other daughter, which I find quite interesting, where apparently she arranged for, I forgot the number, it was 17 or 13. I can't remember which. If you know this number.
Yeah, I think it was 17.
17, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
She tricked 17 young men, I presume MK members, to go to Russia, initially on the idea that apparently they'll be trained to become bodyguards for Jacob Zuma himself. A high honor, I must add. But apparently they've been conscripted into the Russian armed forces in the ongoing war in Ukraine. So this is, I think, why this is interesting, and more than just, a little tidbit in the news, is the continual... what I find interesting is the relationship between MK and the Kremlin. And also that, and the reason I think it ties into the previous topic is that governments in the way are criminal syndicates themselves. And we have a hang of a lot of foreign governments, as well as criminal syndicates, as well as terror organizations, who are currently infusing our government and our political parties and using our local political infrastructure for their own ends. But Ayanda, so would you want to be Jacob Zuma's bodyguard and train in the Kremlin? But you don't have to answer that, because I know, of course, we all want to. Best president. But yeah, no, what's your view on MK's relationship with Putin, and also this debacle of South African politicians sending South African young men to go die in a foreign war?
Look, just briefly, I will get to the MK thing. I do want to speak about that as well. Look, I think even the general himself has said this quite on a number of occasions, that they aren't, it usually isn't their intention, and this comes from him, of course, it usually isn't their intention to murder criminals, because at the end of the day, these are criminals who could lead them to other criminals at the end of the day. Maybe they might be working with other gangs or something like that. So if you're going to murder someone, you're murdering someone who could assist you or who could give you a lead to someone else. So when I listen to that as well, what I get is that it isn't in your best interest, at least as a law enforcement officer who wants to bust, these big crime networks and stuff, to want to murder people. So this kind of intellectual kind of masturbation that we want to engage in now, and all this stuff, I think is also unhelpful, because the general himself has said that we aren't interested in killing criminals. If you do suspect that has happened, that has happened, then take it to IPID. Take it to IPID. That's why we have IPID. IPID deals with these kinds of things, but not this, kind of, as I've said, masturbation where we draw false binaries in an attempt to try and prove your superiority over someone. Maybe I don't know. But onto the MK thing.
Can I answer? Can I answer?
Yeah,
Because that
let's
was
let
that was
Zakes respond to that.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
that was directly directed at my point,
Let's
right?
we can
I
we
don't
can stay
think
on the
it's
criminal topic. Yeah.
fair. It's still on the criminal top. I don't think it's intellectual masturbation to talk about police murdering suspected criminals. I don't think it is. I don't think it is an intellectual act. Like, people died, people who have families, people, they are who are suspected. And this is the important part. When you are still dealing with police officers, you are suspected of committing a crime. And I'm saying, if the police officers are acting in self-defense, I'll always be, in defense of self-defense, because I want that for individuals. But we must keep in mind that we are dealing with the state. Like, when the state kills one of its citizens, it at least should raise an eyebrow. It is not an intellectual exercise to say, hey, I don't want the state having more power to do that, which was my point, by the way, which was my point. And I'm sure there are IPID cases that are being investigated, but you must understand that IPID is also not a part of the South African criminal justice system. IPID was supposed, like, the general himself did not go to IPID. The general himself does not trust IPID. And you're saying that, like, we should just let IPID handle the thing. And I get it, right? I get it. I just don't think that it's an intellectual exercise to talk about lives that were taken at the hands of the state. It is not, right? If there is proof and evidence that these people, outside of the words, because, like, the criminals can also say that I was not shooting at you. If there's evidence, if all these things can be taken to court, and I'm sure that there will be. Some have been litigated, some have not been. But I'm saying, if there's evidence of harm on the part of the officers' lives, we have laws governing reasonable defense. Murder is the illegal killing of someone. So if you can show that you killed someone legally, then it is not murder, right? But I find it sad, because my main point is that the police officer gets to have that process whilst he's alive. The criminal doesn't, because he's dead. And I think, like, this is something that we should be acutely aware of. It is a dangerous path to walk down on, because, like, all of our rights, we are all potential criminals. But you just said it yourself. You are, in the eyes of Amapanyaza, we're a potential criminal. And I'm saying, if we give law enforcement entities the power to be able to sniff you out, just because you are still, because until you get to court, you aren't a convicted criminal. So if we're saying that is somehow justifiable, reasonable, outside of self-defense, right? In self-defense, yes, always justifiable. But outside of that, and we have to have evidence of that, then I find it to be quite dangerous. But to your point, I don't think it's intellectual. It's an intellectual exercise. As I said, like, lives were lost. So lives aren't an intellectual exercise.
Yeah. Now, if I may intervene, because I think I actually am in the middle of you guys here, because I actually see both of you guys' points. I think it is an intellectual exercise in both ways, and I don't think it's intellectual masturbation. I think that I can understand the allure of wanting to be really tough on criminals. I think there's something that I think I'd be lying. I think a lot of people would be lying if we looked, for example, at El Salvador and saw their results for shutting down these gangs and fighting violent crime, whatever, and we didn't think a little bit, at least in the back of our minds, hey, this is maybe we should embrace this. But I think it's also, that's why it's so important to fight the temptation towards tyranny. And I think that's why it's incredibly important to have these systems, because you say, like, this is why I would tell people, if we had perfect knowledge, if we had a utopian system where we knew everything without a fraction of a doubt, I'd be pro death penalty. But I'm not going to be pro death penalty, because there's always that chance that they got it wrong and you can't go back from death. And I think that's and also, as you said, that the police can be investigated for their crimes. The suspect, because they're not necessarily a criminal yet, because it's innocent until proven guilty. At the same time, I also recognize that I don't like that a lot of the police are being put under too much scrutiny by people who I think don't really have the right to put it in. I think they can be investigators, proper investigative reporters, proper watchdogs. They should be a part of it. And the thing I'm talking about here is that there was a case in KZN a year or two ago where the special tactical squad tracked down this murderous gang that who had raped and pillaged their way across a large part of KZN, and they went to go arrest them, and then and they followed all the procedures, and then they were fired upon. And there were witnesses. We know that it was actually the police actually were shot at first, and then they shot and they killed the criminals. Self-defense. For us, I don't think that's going to be controversial here for any of us. But that case was grabbed in the media and was called extrajudicial killings, where I think a lot of this does come from a lot of left-wing legacy media journalists, where they have this idea that, oh no, you can shoot the person in the leg. Oh no, why are you killing them? No, like, I think that we have to be harsh on criminals proportionate to the level of threat that they're causing at that moment. But at the same time, we can't sacrifice the virtues of a republic with the rule of law, with liberty, with the extremely important principles of innocent until proven guilty. Because I think that even if we're not going to be anarchists, we need to always assume that people with power, elites, the state, are going to inevitably use it for their own ends and to be corrupt at the end of the day. And we don't want to give the state the power to just wantonly kill someone without any possibility of accountability. And I think that's not what, and I know that that's not what you were saying, Ayanda, at all. And I think that as a lot of discussions and arguments can happen, I think in a way we're talking past each other. So, because I will say that at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure that we actually all agree that we want the police to be able to do their jobs effectively, to shut down crime, but we also don't want innocent people being killed or arrested or imprisoned for too long past their when they should be getting a good court case.
Yeah, like every human, right? We want the best of both worlds. We want tough on crime and also liberty. It is the human condition.
And I think we can. Yeah, I think we can have that. That's why I like the idea of just having a professional detective service. I like the idea of devolving the police, because that I think that when you have community policing who understand people on the ground, you're going to get a lot less profiling, because people know the people in their area. They're gonna. That's why you need community involvement. That's why in the southern suburbs is far safer than the Cape Flats. And no, it's not to do with funding, because the Cape Flats gets more public funding than the southern suburbs gets. Our infrastructure in the southern suburbs does not get repaired. We repair it ourselves a lot of the time. Our lights are. I made a joke in the book I'm writing, actually, because it's set in Cape Town, and the one character asks why the lights are never working in the rich areas in Cape Town, and the saying is, and I've driven past like townships in Cape Town, and they're like, hey, their roads are better than ours. But that, so it's nothing to do with it. It's the fact that they are community there's a lot of community policing, and I think that's not because people in townships and Cape Flats don't care about the communities. They care about the communities a lot. It's just that the crime is so bad there. And also, it's very hard to be involved in volunteer charity work and NGOs when you're living hand to mouth, and when you're struggling to find your next meal, and when you're having to work extremely long hours at a job you don't like. Rich people and middle-class people have the resources to get involved in community policing. But it's also very important, regardless. And I think that enabling and giving resources.
I don't think it should be an excuse, right? Like, as much as you say when you're living hand to mouth and everything, it is harder to do charitable work. But I find the idea of liberty to be so appealing is because it teaches you that you cannot outsource the responsibility for yourself, your community, your family to anyone else. You should not outsource it. And I think there's no other way to solve it, right? The communities in those areas have to solve it. They have to, with their most precious resource, which is time, which I'm sure, even though as scarce as it is, we can try and find some way to, direct that scarce resource towards the most important things. So yeah, I do agree with you. Like the communities themselves are the only ones capable of solving their criminal problems. And as you say, that is why there are higher levels of crimes in certain communities and none in others. And no one is responsible for that but the people who live in those communities themselves, notwithstanding all of the factors that may make it harder for them to respond to it. I just think that's like something being hard is not an excuse for one not to do it, right? So
No, you're perfectly
So, yeah.
right there. There's it is an excuse at all. I think it's just it would be an ANC excuse saying, "Oh no, our poverty's so bad, we can't solve it."
That's true.
I feel like an ANC person. No, I think because it was promised, we will just conclude with the MK topic, even though the crime topic, I think we can all agree is far more interesting. And I think, but we can frame it any way we want. We can draw it into the criminal case. Ayanda, you said you had points on the MK point.
Yes, I actually did before I was interrupted, right, and drawn into sort of this kind of intellectual muscle flexing. But to the MK thing, right? To the MK thing, which is important to move away from flexing our intellectual muscles. So what do we know? Sure, like what do we know at this point? What we know, right? And I saw this on MG the other day, that one of the people, and these are allegations, of course, I want to qualify my statement before, again, they are dissected and my views are misrepresented. What has been said by one of the people who is allegedly that side is that they were going to go there and be trained and at some point come back and form part of the security detail of the MK party. That's what we know, right? And at some point, one of the person alleges that when they got that side, there were documents that they were supposed to sign, but they were in a foreign language, of course, that they did not understand. So they refused, right, to sign them. And so the story goes that Duduzile and the other two, I think it's Uma and Koza, if I'm not wrong, can be corrected here. It was apparently them who went that side and they said, no, we want to assure you guys that there's nothing shady going on here or there's nothing funny going on here. You can sign these documents. Once you sign them, you can undergo the process and everything. And apparently that ends up not happening, and they find themselves in that kind of situation that they're in now. And I think not long ago, the presidency announced that they did receive these sort of distress calls from 17 individuals in Donbass, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, who say that they've been lured that side under the pretext of this training program, which will be followed by an employment opportunity. And I think as the both of you know, that is illegal, of course, according to our own laws, to participate in sort of these military programs in foreign jurisdictions, or to assist foreign jurisdictions in as far as these military affairs are concerned. It's illegal. So what I find interesting in all of this is that if it is true, and I want to emphasize this, if it is true, then I find it interesting that Duduzile and others have links to people in Russia. What does that say? Are they working with certain people that side, or certain people that side funneling money into them? We don't know. Is it safe to say that there is influence from that side in MK? Are there any relations between those people? But as the Hawks said, I think they're still investigating. They've just started investigating. So let's allow them to do their job, to investigate, and I think we'll see what comes out of that. But Duduzile, I mean, she's having a very rough year. Aside from this thing, she's also still in out of court because of terrorism charges, related charges back to the unrest a few years back. So it's a very difficult year for her. I don't think she's having a nice time. And in this case, it's her half sister, Nicholas, as you said, who has brought this forward. So that also speaks to family tensions, perhaps family rifts. I would not know, but really, I think for me, what I find interesting in this entire thing is this potential, because these are allegations, is this potential link between the MK party and certain forces in Russia. It's an interesting thing, and if it is true, then it's an interesting thing which raises a whole lot more questions about influence on the party and sort of which interests are being accommodated in that organization.
just jump in. I think that another interesting thing to throw in, and I think it was R.W. Johnson, but I might be wrong, but there was an article, I think last year, discussing ties between MK and the Kremlin. And some really interesting stuff, which I saw myself during the elections, is that groups that you could trace the money trail. So all these like fake news sites, they're posting things about apparently Helen Ziller committing adultery and being possessed by a demon, just all this weird stuff. But, if you repeat it enough, maybe enough voters might be influenced. But a lot of all these sites are popping up, and if you follow the money trail, and they were promoting MK, if you follow the money trail, it was the Kremlin putting them out, and we know that Russia is very good at disinformation and these and playing the psyops game. They're very good at it, and it's very hard to fight it because you can't nuke someone just for completely eroding the the social fabric of your society, aka TikTok, but it's China. But it's a but I think that we can say that Russia has put its investment in MK, possibly to counter that the ANC is probably a little bit too slutty, actually. Because I think ANC like Russia, but they also like China, they like Qatar, they like Iran. You don't want that sort of party. You want someone who's monogamous. You want a good party, good God-fearing party that only wants one man. And that man's name is Putin.
So you don't want no non-monogamous party.
I will say it's quite ironic though that like MK is going to be the monogamous party.
That's what makes the joke layered. Makes it
layered. It's a very complex one. This is very high. There's a Rick and Morty joke. It's got layers. What's a Shrek joke? You peel onions. It's got layers.
Pretty.
But yeah, no, I think I believe myself for what that's worth, and I agree with you that let them do their investigations. I don't trust the Hawks as much as I trusted the Scorpions, but they still sometimes put things out. We can always trust on the infighting within the government to sometimes let out useful information. I do think that a lot of the ANC's Cold War love affair with the Soviet Union has been inherited by MK, because let's face it, MK, like the FF, are just splinters of the ANC, and they inherited a hang of a lot of its old ideology. And I think that coupled that with a hang of a lot of corruption money, because the Russian government is, I think probably even more than the Chinese government, does not mind giving bribes and does not mind lavaging its little warlords with a lot of things. And I think that Russia doesn't like that, probably wanted MK in there, something that they can control, something a little bit, because I think Jacob Zuma is once you can capture him by the purse strings, he's a very, very loyal plant in the country. We saw that with the Guptas, and I think we can see that with the Kremlin now. Zex.
So yeah, was muted there for a while, but I think it's quite interesting, right? I saw a story right now that Duduzile Zuma-Sambudla just resigned from the MKP and also as an MP, right? So I guess she is the fall woman, and the party will say it was all her and it had nothing at all to do with us. And I'm like, oh, okay, it makes sense. But it is interesting, the ties between a foreign government and a party, not even a ruling party, but a pretty big party in any country, something that should be of interest. But to me, the funny parts are and sad. This is sad, right? This is genuinely sad, because I understand where I was a very idealistic young man, right? I could have easily in a past life, if someone said sign up and you go do military training somewhere, I would have signed up, right? In wanting to prepare myself, wanting to be useful to the ideals that I believe in. So that is the sad part to me. But those look like, although they were still young men, they weren't, teenagers or anything like that. Quite young men, but on the older side of young, right? See youth and dad, to those who would know. But so, and that is the concerning part. the part that, you have, man, people in positions of power. And it's my general problem with, South African political leaders, is that you have these people in a position of power who you see someone believes in the things that you say so much that they're willing to move away from their home, right, and go and pursue and do something in pursuit of these ideals. I'm like, even if I disagree with your ideals, or even if I disagree with your policy prescriptions, like, isn't there something in you that makes you just want to do good by that person, right? Like, this person who believes in you and your vision for their society so much, right? And you still screw them over. So that was the sad part. The funny part was that the South African government only told us that they know after the media reported on it. I'm like, that is funny. That is funny, because I remember when there was this, I think a couple of years ago, if not last year, when I think a young man went to join the IDF, and that was something that the South African government, I think the reporting was that it came from them, they knew, and then they released it to the media. But in this instance, it seems to have been the other way around. Because when I've been following the story for quite a while, when News 24 was first reporting it, before the other daughter of Jacob Zuma released a statement, right? I was like, man, is News 24 pulling a fake news on me? Because this cannot be real, right? But they were mentioning names and all of this. I'm like, okay, I guess it is real. And then you had the South African state confirm all of these things. I'm like, okay, then I guess some South African guys were convinced to go to Russia and they were sent to the front line. And now they spend most of their time underground in fear of Ukrainian drones. I was like, man. And I was just watching a War France video on Ukrainian drones. So, yeah, at least that's what my brain immediately went to. So it is unfortunate. Finally, that our government is pretty incompetent. I find it is the security concern. Don't want to say risk or threat, but it is a security concern when a foreign government has the power to pretty much conscript your citizens to go fight a war on their behalf. Right? Like, this is not something that should be able to happen. And if it does happen, it is something that you should know about. It should not, get to the media before we assume it has gotten to you. So yeah, that was the funny sad part. And it should be interesting, right? The investigations should yield some interesting stuff. In the reporting, we saw that there was a letter allegedly that was like written by Jacob Zuma and that was sent to the Kremlin, to the Minister of Defense there, because these guys signed infantry contracts pretty much under false pretenses. They did not know them, and he was pretty much saying that they he asked for the defense minister to let them, to exempt them from their infantry contracts. And I don't know how real that is. Hopefully the investigation tells us. But if it is real, then it means that we have really a former South African president. So maybe that would not make him an ordinary citizen in that regard. But I guess in his capacity as a leader of a party, he has direct communication with a foreign powers defense minister. Also something that probably we should not be finding out through News 24. The source, it doesn't bode well for our intelligence agencies, but it is something interesting. It is something I'm gonna keep an eye on this. I just feel bad for the guys there, right? Like, if you wanna fight a war, choose to fight a war. Nothing is as horrible as being foisted on a war. Even though they probably wanted to fight a war sometime in the future, maybe that's why they got military training. They did not think that the war was coming right now. So that is quite unfortunate. And from the reports, they aren't quite happy. They want to come back home, and I'm like, their lives are forever changed now. And it is sad for me because it was in pursuit of an ideal that they believed in. And yeah, that is unfortunate.
I must add that the Russian army is very diverse now. Like, it's really got that inclusion points.
Yeah.
So it's got DEI things in there, because it's not just the Russian Federation troops, with all the different Slavs and the Muscovites and all those ones. They've also got North Koreans. They probably have some Chinese hiding among the North Koreans. They've now got South Africans. They've probably got some good BE credentials. They could get a tender here. They probably are getting tenders here, actually, now that I think about it. I think we passed the hour now. Ayanda, do you have any closing points? And then Zakes, you can have your closing points and I'll sign off.
Yeah, I think onto the most recent issue, as I really said, Nicholas, allow the respective institutions to do their work to investigate. I think once they've completed that, then we will have more to say. And I think if, as I said, if it is true, then we can have a discussion about the potential implications of that. Back to my earlier point about crime. As I said, I think we have very high levels of crime in South Africa. That is not a good thing, as I said, for investment, but as well also for the safety of people, right, and also people's rights as well. Crime, violent crime that comes directly into conflict with people's rights. I mean, you have someone entering your property, for instance, coming to steal and stuff or trying to harm you. So that is a problem. And I think for me, coming from a province that, as far as I'm concerned, has the highest levels, at least of political violence, specifically political violence. I think even there, having seen the kinds of things that happen, I think it's important for us to really push back against those things and fight crime in South Africa. That's what I'm more concerned about. As I said earlier on, not the intellectual muscle flexing. I think those are my last words.
Zex?
I was trying to make the intellect flex, but I only just flexed myself. But yeah, I'm in agreement with Umake, but we all want crime to be eliminated. It is the how that we disagree on, and I don't think, again, to reiterate this point, it is not an intellectual exercise when you talk about lives that have been lost. These are people who are suspected of committing crimes who were not given an opportunity. Like, this is something that is a given. Criminal justice system, innocent until proven guilty. These are things that are non-negotiable to me. These are principles that I associate intrinsically with my liberty as an individual. And when those are threatened, I cannot say that it is an intellectual exercise, especially when the result is, again, loss of life. Loss of life. Lives were lost. Nothing intellectual about that. But then crime, that's great that the trend is going down. Great that the trend is going down, contributed by Gauteng in most cases. So I hope that spurs a conversation about decentralization. Maybe we have, the principle of having a mapanyaza in every province, and we start solving the criminal, the crime problem that we have in South Africa, right? Which I think it can be solved, but I don't think that we should be as accepting of extrajudicial killings if they are found to be extrajudicial killings. And then the Ukraine MK issue, that to me is a tragic comedy, as I told you this, Nicholas, when we were talking about it earlier. It is both a tragedy and a comedy, and I am interested to see how it plays out. Our politics are anything but interesting, right? Like for their lack of depth in policy perspectives, they make up in over the top entertainment. So yeah, let's look forward to that. And to Makeba's point is right. Let's wait for the investigations to conclude, and I think it will make for a much more interesting conversations once we have tangible facts about the entire situation. And yeah, I hope those guys are able to come back home, man. Nothing. I wouldn't want to be in the front lines of the Ukrainian war. Every video of it does not look nice. So yeah, I hope that they find their way back home.
Are there any wars you would want to be on the front lines of?
Now that I think of, like, I don't know, man. Even when I'm watching like representations of old timey wars where they used to like just line up and wait for each other on plain fields, like, yeah, we're doing this. I'm like, I don't wanna be in the Roman phalanx, I don't think that it's a nice thing.
War is
I don't
hell.
want to.
I'd want to be part. The only war I'd possibly want to be in is the fishing wars between Iceland and Britain, where they were just stealing each other's nets constantly. I still think some people did die, by the way. So it did get a little bit.
We should show you, like, almost suck.
Yeah,
I don't think
war
there's
is
any that
hell.
I'd want to be one, but not like the Ukrainian one has every horrible thing about modern warfare, just mangled up into one. And I'm like,
it might not be the same
man,
scale, but in terms of innovation, it's this generation's World War One. It's
pretty much, right?
new technology
Pretty
plus
much.
old world tactics.
All,
Yeah. Okay, but
yeah,
this was a very interesting discussion. I think as peaceman, I think everyone here is correct. I think brownie points all around. And as my part, I think actually no, you're all wrong. I think we just have to have millions of detectives. I think everyone should just be a detective.
Yeah.
That's my response to how we solve crime. And I think also we should bring some Ukrainian drones to commit some extrajudicial killings in South Africa. But thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Rational Side podcast. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Follow us on the website formerly known as Twitter, on Facebook, and make sure to subscribe to our Substack, rationalstandard.com. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and cheers.